Hello and welcome to the recorded version of my series of lectures entitled One Nation Under God, a survey of America's Christian heritage. And this is for the ABF Summer Scramble of Summer 2021. Okay, so what's this class about? This class is about studying the Christian heritage of the founding of our country and the influences that it had on the colonists and the founding fathers when they declared independence and eventually created the government that we more or less live under today. So in this class we want to explain the religious character of the original 13 colonies. That's what we'll be doing in the first week. Secondly, learn about the influence that Christian principles had on the founding era and the important figures of the time period. And then finally, respond to modern criticism of the role of Christianity that it played in the formation of the United States, and see if we can answer some of those common arguments made that want to minimize or even eliminate the influence that Christianity had in the United States. And as kind of a foundational passage we're looking at here, as far as, why is it important for us to remember these things? 2 Chronicles 7:14 tells us that if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin, and will heal their land. And so let's get started with a look at the 13 colonies, and we'll divide them up into 3 different groups. And each one, of course, was distinct culturally, economically, and also religiously. And we'll divide them into the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies, as they're commonly divided in American history textbooks and such. And we'll begin with the New England colonies. Now, if you know much about English history, or perhaps you watched my lessons on the Protestant Reformation from a couple of years ago, you may recall that England in the 1600s was not a happy place when it came to issues of religion. It was a bitterly divided land between those who wanted to keep the nation Catholic and those who wanted to go away from Catholicism and make the country Protestant of some kind. And one of the consequences of the reign of Queen Elizabeth is that the nation became divided. The Protestants themselves became divided into 2 groups of people. Elizabeth started a series of reforms to kind of try and find the middle road between Catholics and Protestants. It's sometimes called the Elizabethan settlement. But Protestants who were unhappy with this compromise fell into generally one of 2 camps. They were either called Puritans, or they were called separatists. And these were people who were unhappy to some degree with the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. And many of these people came to what would later be the United States for their own distinct reasons. So let's look at the separatists first. The separatists, as their name implies, are people who want to completely separate from the Church of England. These believers they have a vision for a future where there is no state religion. There is no state church. What we would call separation of church and state. And so they do not want to submit to a state church. They want to worship however they want to. And a small group of these people end up going to Holland in 1607. Separatists were persecuted by basically anybody, but they were able to find toleration and peace in Holland. And they were there for number of years until they decided that the cultural influence of the Dutch on their younger generations, their kids, were something they didn't want to see happen, and they wanted to maintain their English identity. So in 1620, they returned to England, led by a man named William Bradford, and they struck a deal with a English joint stock company to board an expedition to America, where they felt they could establish their own community that would preserve not only their religious ideals but also their cultural heritage. And by this point, you probably recognize that these people are indeed the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were originally supposed to have 2 ships that take them to America, but they ended up only having 1 because the other one had seaworthiness issues. And that ship that they did take the journey on was, of course, the Mayflower. Now, the Separatists, or the Pilgrims as they were later known, were supposed to land within the jurisdiction of the Virginia colony, which was already established, although in those days the borders of the Virginia colony were much, much more expansive. They were really supposed to land somewhere near the Hudson River area, but as was very common in those days, the trip across the Atlantic was perilous, and storms blew the ship way off course, and it ended up coming ashore, or near the shore of what would be New England, outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia colony. They were low on supplies, and winter was approaching, and so trying to travel south to the Virginia area was not really practical. So they decided they needed to land right where they were. And taking the opportunity to kind of, disassociate themselves from their previous English company that they had signed up with, they hashed out a quick agreement amongst themselves as far as how the colony would be ruled, what principles it would be ruled by, what rights would the people have. And that ended up being the Mayflower Compact, which was signed before they left the ship, and is an important piece of American history because it outlines many principles that would later influence some members of the founding era. The document was signed on board the Mayflower, and this is what it says. In the name of God, amen. We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God an advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one of another covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. And by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have hereunder subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France and Ireland the 18th, and of Scotland the 54th, Anno Domini 1620. And so basically they are remarking that they are going to create a colony together where laws will be passed for the general good of the colony, and that the colonists themselves will be loyal to that government. And also, of course, declaring their allegiance to the King of England. And that's the Mayflower Compact. It's interesting to note that there is a replica of the Mayflower in existence, the Mayflower II. And here it is in dry dock, and again at sea. Now, it would be a couple of centuries before the separatists who came to Cape Cod would eventually be given the name Pilgrims, or originally the Pilgrim Fathers, as they were called. But you probably are familiar with the story of them coming ashore, founding the colony of Plymouth, enduring quite a bit of hardship, particularly at the beginning. They did not have enough food, and many of them died during the first winter. They were only saved due to the benevolent intervention of Native Americans who helped them find food and plant corn and all that kind of thing, and eventually leading them to hold a special feast to give thanks to God, which we give them credit as being the first Thanksgiving. Here is a map of the area showing you where the Plymouth colony was, there in the southeast. But the separatists would not be the only group to come to New England. In fact, soon afterwards, a much larger group would arrive just north of them in Massachusetts Bay. That, of course, is the Puritans. The Puritans began arriving in Massachusetts Bay beginning in 1630, and over the next decade or so, tens of thousands of them would arrive from England. And in contrast to the Pilgrims, the Puritans were generally of a higher economic status, wealthier, better organized, more ships, and just a more successful overall venture than the Plymouth colony. The Puritans were led by John Winthrop, and he is famous for his extensive writing about why the Puritans were there and what their goals were as a people in Massachusetts Bay. This is what he had to say about their colony there. The Lord will be our God, and delight to dwell among us as his one people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, where 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies. When he shall make us pray and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord is likely that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God, and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of the many of God's worthy servants, and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. And so John Winthrop is saying that we are here to create a Christian society, and if we fail, there will be very serious consequences. Now, the Puritans were very serious about this Christian mission, especially at first. Their theology is interesting. We'll take a look at that next. Their theology was very much centered upon the idea of a covenant, or a legally binding relationship with God, that they needed to do what they were doing because that was their I don't want to use the word obligation, but that was their relationship with God, is that's the way they would organize themselves, the way they would live their lives. They would often talk about different covenants: covenant of grace, covenant of works, covenant of redemption, and would take a verse like Romans 12:1 very seriously, which says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And so they took that very seriously. Something else that they took very seriously was their emphasis on education. And I actually talked about this a couple years ago in my Protestant Reformation class, but the reason that they were so interested in making sure that their people had at least a basic education was because they wanted their people to be able to read the Bible on their own, which was in contrast to a lot of other colonies and nations that were Catholic, because the emphasis on reading the Bible isn't typically so pronounced. Evidence of this comes in the 1640s, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the main Puritan colony, began passing laws requiring families to educate their children. In 1647, it kind of went up a notch when they passed a law, famously known as the Old Deluder Satan Act, which required communities to fund a school for their children. And I will read to you the law itself and its explanation as to why it was important to make schools for their communities. It being one chief project of that old deluder, Satan, to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures, as in former times, keeping them in an unknown tongue, they're talking about Latin, so in these later times by persuading from the use of tongues, so that at least the true sense and meaning of the original might be clouded by false glosses of saint-seeming deceivers, and that learning may not be buried in the graves of our forefathers in church and commonwealth, the Lord assisting our endeavors, it is therefore ordered by this court and authority thereof, that every township in this jurisdiction, after the Lord hath increased them to the number of 50 householders, shall then forthwith appoint one within their own town to teach all such children as shall resort to him to write and read, whose wages shall be paid either by the parents or the masters of such children, or by the inhabitants in general, by way of supply, as the major part of those that order the prudentials of the town shall appoint. provided that those which send their children be not oppressed by paying much more than they can have them taught for in other towns. And it is further ordered that when any town shall increase to the number of 100 families or householders, they shall set up a grammar school, the masters thereof being able to instruct youth so far as they may be fitted for the university. And if any town neglect the performance hereof above 1 year, then every such town shall pay £5 per annum to the next such school till they shall perform this order. So, this law is basically saying, has a lot of legal speak in it, but it is basically saying that because we know that the Satan wants to keep the knowledge of the Bible out of our people as much as possible, and has done so in the past, we're going to make it a priority to fund schools. So 50 families, you do this much, and 100 families, you do that much. And surely the people who wrote this had this verse in mind from Proverbs 22, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, the law also mentions that they be the graduates of the grammar school be fit for going to the university. And what university was that? Well, there wasn't a university, of course, in Massachusetts at that time. And even back in England, it was not easy to get into higher education. It was very much restricted. There were only 2 colleges in England at the time that were allowed to give degrees, and that would, of course, be Oxford and Cambridge. So the Puritan colonists decided that they would create their own college with its own degrees, and that is the origin of Harvard in 1636. Remarkable, only 6 years after they arrived in Massachusetts, they're already thinking about founding a college for their people. And if you visit Harvard, there's even some plaques around that at least give some semblance of some scrap of the story of their origins. Of course, they don't hold to it anymore, but this is on one of the gates you can see. This plaque says, "After God had carried us safe to New England, and we had builded our houses, provided necessaries for our livelihood, reared convenient places for God's worship, and settled the civil government, one of the next things we longed for and looked after was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust." So, again, there's that very much that thinking about the future and wanting to make sure that there are a cadre of well-trained pastors to fill the churches of New England well into the future. And that was the original purpose of Harvard, if you can believe it. So the Puritans, therefore, have they're well known for their strong work ethic. They're well known for their strictness too, but also their seriousness when it came to their relationship with God. And the Puritan work ethic is something that they're very especially known for. And they come from adherence to verses like this in Proverbs, talking about being diligent, working hard, not being slothful, that they needed to work with their hands, like this verse says. Another one from 1 Thessalonians talks about the need to study and be quiet and do your own business and work with your own hands as we have commanded you, the apostles telling the believers that. And again in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, "For even when we were with you, we commanded you that if any would not work, neither should he eat." Not only a biblical foundation for that kind of policy, but if you're familiar with the story of Jamestown, you know that that's exactly what they had to resort to in that settlement due to a lack of people willing to work. Well, the Puritans didn't generally have that problem. They were very much a hardworking people. And I think some of that, definitely, that cultural heritage trickled down to the future United States as well. The Puritans were also known for sometimes being perhaps a little too strict, perhaps. For a couple of humorous examples I'll show you here, like this notice from 1659 saying that the observance of Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege, the exchanging of gifts and greetings, dressing in fine clothing, feasting, and similar satanical practices are hereby forbidden. with the offender liable to a fine of 5 shillings. I wonder what they would say if they could see us now. Or another funny example is the case of Captain Thomas Kimball, who was a well-known merchantman at the time in the mid-1600s. In 1653, he set sail on a business trip. He was gone for 3 years, and upon his return home, he was greeted at his door on his porch by his wife, and he kissed his wife. And in so doing, he broke 2 very important laws. First of all, his kiss was judged to be lewd and unseemly behavior, and his second offense was that it had happened on a Sunday, and therefore he had failed to keep the Sabbath properly. And so Captain Thomas Kimball spent 2 hours in the stocks for his crimes. Well, not all of the people who came to Massachusetts found themselves in agreement with the Puritan Church, and generally speaking, those who began to speak out against it or to contradict it would usually find themselves in a hostile relationship with the colonial government. And sometimes this meant you had to change your tune or just be quiet, or in more extreme cases, it could mean banishment or even execution. One person who was banished from the Massachusetts colony was Roger Williams. Roger Williams is usually given credit as founding the Baptist church movement in America. He had come to New England, settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but he had theological differences with the Puritan Church. For one thing, he believed that baptism should only be done by immersion for professing believers, as opposed to infant baptism. And he also disagreed with the way that the Puritans combined their civil and religious governments together, and felt that the civil government should not have any interaction, any connection with the church. Now, in his day, most churches were of one of 2 different types of church organization, or we might call them church polity. It just means political organization. You could have something like the Church of England had, which we call Episcopal polity today, in which it's very much a top-down kind of flow of authority, where you have a person at the top who then delegates power down, 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 till you get to the congregation at the bottom. Or you could have a Presbyterian polity. The Presbyterians were another separatist group who came to America later, and they used the opposite approach, where you still had an organized church polity with multiple churches, connected together, but the authority went from the congregation up, where they would elect members of what they would call a church session. Members of the session would attend a presbytery and the synod and the general assembly for like a huge, region. Well, the Baptists kind of eschewed both of those different types of organization and instead used something called congregational polity. And in fact, eventually, when the name Puritan kind of falls out of use, a lot of people like Roger Williams and his followers would just be called Congregationalists. Congregational polity just means that the church is completely independent of all other churches. It's not associated with any kind of regional organization or nationwide church. It is completely independent, and usually also means that the authority flows upward from the congregation, who elect elders or some kind of group, and then they also choose a pastor and that kind of thing. So our church, Colonial Hills Baptist Church, is a good example of a congregational church. Like I also said, Roger Williams was very much opposed to enforced uniformity by a state government, and felt that it actually was unbiblical and hurt the religious health of the community. And so this led him to become a strong proponent of what we would later call separation of church and state. Now, his beliefs got him banished, like I said, from the Massachusetts colony, and it almost led to his death. They banished him right around the beginning of winter, and he was only saved by the help of Native Americans, and he eventually made his way to what would become Rhode Island and decided to found his own colony there with his followers and started the settlement of Providence. and that eventually became its own colony. Now, he had to go to England to get a charter for this colony to make it separate from Massachusetts, and he also wanted to make it so that there would be no state church, which was no small feat because he had to go to Parliament and convince them this was okay. And so he did, and he made some speeches and eventually got what he wanted. And this is some of what he said in his defense of having no state church. First, that the blood of so many 100,000 souls of Protestants and Papists, split in the wars of present and former ages for their respective consciences, is not required nor accepted by Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. So he's talking about the wars of religion that occurred in the 16th and 17th centuries. God requireth not a uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state, which enforced uniformity, sooner or later, is the greatest occasion of civil war, ravishing of conscience, persecution of Christ Jesus and his servants, and of the hypocrisy and destruction of millions of souls. Essentially saying that it's going to lead to civil wars, and it's going to lead to the weakening of religion in your country, not the strengthening of it, because it doesn't make converts, really. I think William Penn, who we'll talk about pretty soon here, is famous for saying that, force doesn't make converts, it's a persuasion that makes converts. And this is generally true in history, that religious persecution usually just doesn't work. It doesn't accomplish what it says it's going to do, which is eradicate a religious dissension. It just generally does not work. And so that's kind of Roger Williams' legacy that he is remembered for, is founding the Baptist movement, founding Rhode Island, and also being a big early proponent of separation of church and state. Okay, that's it for New England. The last two we'll go through a little more quickly, and we'll go to the middle colonies next. Okay, now the middle colonies were generally more tolerant than the New England colonies or southern colonies, and this led to them becoming more attractive for immigration by places other than England. And also because some of the middle colonies had originally belonged to other European nations that had been conquered by the English, this also contributed to the fact that these colonies are more ethnically and therefore religiously diverse. There were Dutch colonies like New York, and Swedish colonies like New Jersey, I believe, was originally Swedish. This made the middle colonies more of a melting pot of different cultures and different religions. Perhaps no colony in America at the time showed this sort of tolerant-ish message more than Pennsylvania. You may recall that the story of Pennsylvania is an interesting one, in which the King of England gave the colony to William Penn because of some debts that the king owed his father, and named the colony Pennsylvania, which means Penn's wood. And William Penn is an interesting personality, in some ways very progressive for his age, shall we say, in that he firmly believed that Native Americans needed to be dealt with peacefully and respectfully, imagine that, and also did not want to institute any kind of religious persecution in his colony, and felt that, in the vein of Roger Williams almost, that there should be just absolute religious tolerance in Pennsylvania. It's important to point out, though, when we're talking about religious toleration, we're still talking about pretty much just Christianity. There are very few members of other religions in the 13 colonies. They're probably the most likely would be Jews. But other than that, when they say religious toleration, they're saying, really, in their world, religious toleration of different groups of Christians, different kinds of Christians, basically. Catholics, Anglicans, Puritans, Baptists, whatever. Now, William Penn himself was of an interesting religious group. He was, of course, a Quaker, or as they called themselves, the Society of Friends. The term Quaker is actually a derogatory name given to them by their critics for the fact that some Quakers would shake and quake during their religious services. Now, the Quakers were similar to Puritans in that they opposed the corruption of the Anglican Church, but that was pretty much the only similarity that they have. The Quaker movement was started by a man named George Fox, who claimed to have received illumination from something that he called the inner light. And the inner light meant that their theology would be quite different. It's more of like an experience and emotion-based kind of religion. They also had some doctrinal differences. For instance, they denied the Trinity. They rejected the position of pastor. In fact, if you ever look at Puritan churches or paintings of them, you will notice that there's no pulpit. Usually the benches or chairs are arranged in a large square or circle where people facing inward towards each other. They essentially believed in a salvation through good works kind of system, or what they would call the spark of grace. And instead of relying on the Bible for their primary guidance, spiritual guidance, they relied on the inner light. And the inner light was supposed to be this sort of emotional, experience you felt during a service of theirs. In fact, I believe that that piece of art at the bottom there with the man clutching his chest is supposed to be an instance of a man suddenly receiving guidance from the inner light. Either that or he's about to have a heart attack. I'm not really sure, honestly. And so that's the Quakers. The Quakers were also very much most of them were known for being pacifist, very religiously tolerant, and just generally kind of wanting to keep to themselves. Allegedly, we've had 2 Quaker presidents, it's worth pointing out. When I was reading about this, I was kind of surprised. Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon, interestingly enough, were allegedly coming from Quaker families. And that is the Quakers. Now, it's interesting to note, too, we'll talk about this more in future weeks when we talk about the Constitution and religious toleration and accommodation, even in our founding documents. One of the very first instances of accommodation for a religious minority in America is found in the Constitution in reference to, actually, Quakers. This comes in Article 2, Section 1, which is talking about the presidential oath of office. And it says, before he, the president, enter the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath, or affirmation. I do solemnly swear, or affirm, that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. If you've ever wondered why the Constitution gives them the option of swearing an oath or affirming an oath, that's actually an early concession to Quakers who had a religious conviction against the term swear. And so in order to make it so that Quakers could serve in political office, the Constitution includes the phrase or affirm, or really for anyone that was prefer the term affirm. But the Quakers were one of the better known ones who would fall into that category. William Penn also had a pretty big impact on the way government is thought of at the time in America. He wrote down his ideas in a document called Frame of Government of Pennsylvania. There are actually several of these frames. And he described his vision for his colony and also had several different features that would later be incorporated into American government later on. For instance, one of them was limiting capital punishment to murder and treason, which is generally the only things we use it for today, and if at all. But you have to remember that capital punishment could have been used for a wide variety of things back in those days, for crimes other than murder and treason. Pennsylvania's government also included a system for impeaching the governor if he failed in his duties, and created a vague but nevertheless a system for writing amendments to Pennsylvania's government, so that if there were problems that needed to be addressed, instead of having to scrap the whole government and start over, they could write amendments to it instead. And I've included a little bit of his frame of government describing his vision for government here in America. William Penn had this to say: When the great and wise God had made the world, of all his creatures it pleased him to choose man, his deputy, to rule it, and to fit him for so great a charge and trust. He did not only qualify him with skill and power, but with integrity to use them justly. Any government is free to the people under it, whatever be the frame, where the laws rule and the people are party to those laws, essentially advocating for and defending the concept of a democratic type of government. Okay, and finally, we'll take a quick look at the southern colonies. The southern colonies were more dominated by English gentry and not necessarily religious dissenters, for the most part, at least particularly at first. And so they're going to be a little bit different. In the southern colonies, the Christian denomination that was the most prevalent was the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Now, the Anglican Church also had different divisions within it. Most of the Anglicans who came to the southern colonies were what we call low church Anglicans. Low church Anglicans are Anglicans who are, similar to Puritans doctrinally, but are okay with the Church of England's worship style, as opposed to high church Anglicans who are not only more Catholic leaning in their worship style, but also more Catholic leaning in their theology. You may wonder, is the Church of England still around here in America? I'm sure it is, but the original Anglican Church in America eventually became the Episcopal Church. I'm trying to think of the right term there. During the American Revolution, of course, they, for obvious reasons, had to split from the Church of England, and so now they're called the Episcopal Church. So there were many really genuine believers in the Anglican Church in the southern colonies. One of the best known is James Blair, who helped found the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Williamsburg, Virginia, and also became the college's first president. And he's even responsible for suggesting that the capital of Virginia be moved to Williamsburg when the State House in Jamestown burned down for, the third time. So after the third time it burned down, they were like, okay, let's move it to somewhere else. And that would be all we're going to say about the southern colonies. So in conclusion, that was a lot of information. In conclusion, the main gist we're getting at here is that religious motivations were immensely important to the American colonists for one reason or another. Many American colonists believed that the civil government and the church should be connected in some way, like Puritans who believed that they should be one and the same. But there were others who felt that this was a bad idea and that we should embrace separation of church and state instead. Now, in contrast to perhaps the modern view of separation of church and state, it's important, I think, to point out that the men and women who thought this, especially someone like, say, Roger Williams, wanted separation of church and state because they felt that civil involvement weakened religion, not that religion weakened the government, which is probably what most people would say if you ask them today, why should we have separation of church and state? So there is a difference. This is summed up, I think, quite nicely by a preacher named Isaac Backus, who said, hey, he's talking about a government, an ideal government, where each person and each society are equally protected from being injured by others, all enjoying equal liberty, to attend and support the worship which they believe is right, having no more striving for master or superiority than little children. How happy are its effects in civil society. And that is where we will end it for today. So we have finished our overview of the religious character of the 13 colonies, and in the next video we'll be talking about the First Great Awakening. So thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next video.